Justin R. White says, you've spoken about the baked-in nature of time, i.e., we have free will, yet our actions are already established in time as a whole. Would the existence of a supernatural being beyond those confines explain biblical descriptions of God as simultaneously was, is, and is to come? That's the question, Justin. And look, I've always had a strong science bent, and I've always believed in science as a tool. I don't believe in it as a religion. I don't believe it as a philosophy. But I have a very high respect for science's ability to detect and explain extraordinarily difficult, subtle things about nature. We're talking about the Big Bang a minute ago. The fact that we have the minds, we can do experiments and have the mathematical minds and the imagination to run the clock back to 1/100,000th of a second after the Big Bang. Beyond that was the Planck frontier. We can't see beyond that. That's an awful lot of amazing brain work. Just getting in an airplane and flying in a commercial jet from New York to Los Angeles is an astonishing mastery of physics and metallurgy, chemistry, all the rest. So I've always had a great deal of respect for experimental results. And when I was a complete atheist, objectivist kind of a guy, Richard Dawkins kind of guy, I took that position because that's where the evidence was. Once I saw the experiment that Carl Sagan did, this was about 13 when I went through this, where basically you take the elements from a gas giant, which are in abundance in the universe, hydrogen, helium, methane, and ammonia. And I don't know if it was Sagan who did it, but it's certainly Sagan who wrote about it. You take hydrogen, helium, methane, and ammonia, you put it in a glass bottle, you run a little electric spark through it. And what comes out of the water, what comes out on the side is this brown stuff called amino acids, and they're the building blocks of life. And that, to me, was a perfectly reasonable mechanical explanation for how life started. And nothing on that has changed. But if you want to know what really changed me and made me realize just how narrow that view was, and how incredibly provincial it was, and how arrogant I was, and how sure I was of it, the thing that changed my mind is actually very simple, and it's changed a lot of people's minds in science, and that is the nature of the quantum universe. So we've been spending all this time talking about the big universe of gravity and massive objects and huge distances in large amounts of time. But when you look in the other direction, you don't see the same kind of order that you see out in the outer universe. You don't see the same kind of order you see here today. Newton thought that the universe was essentially a giant clock that got wound up because all of the physical reactions could be understood. And for most of the intervening last 300-400 years, people thought it was just a question of better instruments that allow us to understand how all these forces are in motion. Everything's predictable. Everything's knowable, but predictable is the word. So it comes as a great shock, a really great shock, to find endless mountains of evidence. Look, we're only having this conversation because we understand quantum effects. When we get down to the very small, we find something really shocking. And what we find is that the nature of matter is fluid. It appears, I don't have a great understanding of it, but basically, when you get down to the very small levels, the universe essentially hasn't made up its mind on the small scale, and that the universe, I'm not going to even say the universe because it sounds like the hippy-dippy universe. Nature, matter, and energy, matter essentially decides how it's going to be constructed when you look at it, because before you look at it, it's in both states. This is the entire Schrodinger's cat argument. When there's a 50-50 chance of a cat in a box, and there's a 50-50 chance that this fuse is going to break through and release a poison that kills the cat. It is exactly 50% chance. So, according to quantum theory, the reason this analogy works is that if you don't look in the box, is the cat dead or alive? And quantum tells you it's a stupid argument, self-defeating argument. The cat is both dead and alive in the box. It exists in a state of in-between and both simultaneously, and it doesn't decide. The cat doesn't decide the nature of quantum doesn't decide whether the cat's alive or dead until somebody opens the box and looks in. Then by looking into the box, you're forcing nature to make a decision. I know that's an extremely bizarre thing to say. It's more bizarre to see it turn out experimentally all the time, but it's exactly true. When we observe something, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle blew my mind, but that's only a small part of it. Heisenberg said that you can determine the position of an electron, or you can determine its speed or direction, but you cannot determine both. If you look at one, it locks the other one out. That seemed like, wow, that's kind of odd. But more and more and more, what we find out is on the very small level that everything is a series of probabilities. These probabilities exist in a sort of a formlessness, and you observe something, and when you observe something, it gives you back a result. It gives you a result. As a quick aside, yes, this, right, where is it? Yes, that is the, yeah, there. Hey, it's so hard to do this. That is, in fact, the Gorn captain who's fallen off the wall, and I don't have time to put him back up yet. So back to this quantum thing. Yes, it's absolutely uncanny. When you look at something, you change it. So, what does that have to do with God? Well, if we're capable with our little monkey brains, if our little cantaloupe-sized gray jelly is capable of looking at nature on a small scale, and by observing it, we essentially create it, we essentially give it form, then it's not a hard thing for me to make the leap to say, well, I don't expect that this couple of pounds of gray jelly is in fact the greatest consciousness in the universe. It probably is, but let's say it's not. Then if I can change the force, if I can change the structure of nature and matter by observing it, then who's to say that a far greater intelligence is not able to change the nature of matter by observing it as well, and change it to such a degree where it creates things? Because we can create things. We take an experiment where we shoot light through a couple of slots, and light will behave as either a particle or a wave. And as it turns out that when we don't look at it, it behaves one way, and when we look at it, even with a camera, it turns the other way. It looks different. It behaves like, I forget which is which, but let's just say it's a particle, behaves like a particle, and then we turn a camera on or we peek in the door, and then it behaves like a wave. I know that sounds impossible, but it's not. It's actually true. So if our little monkey brains can observe and create the structure of the universe on a very, very small scale, then it's not hard for me at all to imagine a consciousness great enough to simply think things into existence. And if that's not God, then I don't know what is. And we're also not just the prisoners of probability on the quantum level. We're also the prisoners of our dimensional limitations. If we imagine a flat land of people that live on a perfectly flat surface, and essentially, even though a deck of cards has some thickness, not hard for us to imagine. It's impossible to imagine a perfectly flat plane that has no depth whatsoever. We can't imagine it. We can only imagine it smaller and smaller and thinner, but we can't imagine it. But if beings lived in a two-dimensional world, we'd be able to look down on their lives in 2 dimensions and see things that they couldn't imagine. We'd be able to see inside their houses because there'd be no roofs on their houses. There'd be no roofs on their houses because there's no 3rd dimension for a roof. So a flatlander locking himself in his room would walk into essentially a cube with a square with a hole on one side, and he'd close a flap, and he'd be locked out. Nobody else could get in, but we can look directly down into him and not only see what he's doing in that little room, we can also look inside him. We can see his digestive system because he has no 3rd dimension to block our vision. There's nothing in between us and him. It's all accessible to us in the 3rd dimension. There's nothing in the 2nd dimension that we can't see, and things that are secret or enclosed in the 2nd dimension are obvious to us. It's not like we have to look down. It's not like we have to look for it. It's there. When we perceive the 2nd dimension, we see everything inside of 2nd dimensional creatures instantly because we're in the 3rd dimension. This is undoubtedly true for the 4th dimension, and that means that if there's a 4th dimensional being watching me right now, what he's able to do is take a position that's not up or down. It's not either length or width or breadth, but it's a 4th dimension perpendicular to the other 3. That's impossible. It's virtually impossible to imagine, but you can get the shadow of it. And he's able to look down into this room, and he can see. He's not above the ceiling. He's beyond the ceiling. So he not only looks into this room, which is closed, and can see me and everything that's going on, he can also look and see all of my internal organs, because the third dimension's not an obstacle to him. So he can see all of my internal organs simultaneously, see the inside and the outside of the room simultaneously, and all of this. And that's the fourth dimension. And there's no reason to believe that there's not fifth, sixth, seventh dimensions and so on. When you get into this kind of a universe and these kind of probability trees and all the rest of it, then you certainly cannot lock out the idea of a God. And the more you understand about it, the more reasonable it becomes to me. When you get really into it, hard into it, you start to see things that this cascade of probabilities, this sense that once we start looking at things, it has to make a decision from the subatomic level all the way up to, cats and galaxies. Then once you understand that to be true, and it is true, it's strange but true, then you begin to realize something really, really remarkable, and that is this. I used to believe that intelligence and consciousness was not the result of God, but it was the result of a mechanical universe. And the more we learn, we begin to realize, no, the mechanical universe is the result of the consciousness. Isn't that a bitch? It's that the universe is not made out of matter or even gravity. It's made out of information. It's made out of information, observations, and decisions. This is experimentally true. How somebody like Richard Dawkins, who's certainly smart enough to know this, can sit there and say that the whole idea of a God who created the universe is not just theoretically impossible, but nonsense. It's juvenile. It's a form of childishness to believe that. How he has access to the same information I do. I'm sure he's smarter than I am, and he's a scientist, but once you understand that by looking in a room, you change the nature of what is going on the wall in that room by looking, then everything else falls into place, right? If my little monkey brain can look at things and make changes, then somebody's bigger brain should be able to look into a room and create what it wants to do, because observation creates reality. And the more sophisticated the observation, the more sophisticated reality has to become in order to keep up, because now you're asking more and more probability waves to compress. You're asking them to make a decision. This leads to an interesting theory, which I don't particularly subscribe to, but if it turns out that humanity is the only intelligence in the universe, which seems unlikely, then the argument, I think it's called the anthropic principle. Well, it's not the anthropic principle, it's slightly different. But the argument then is that when the greatest consciousness in the universe is a bunch of cavemen sitting around a campfire who look up and think that the stars are basically little campfires in the sky, little sparks in the sky, then that is in fact what they are. That's not just what they appear to be, that's what they are. Stars are just little specks, little sparks in the sky that we perceive, and as we become smarter and bring out telescopes, then just the act of looking through a telescope forces the universe to become more complex. This is so counterintuitive to us. It's so counterintuitive to us. And as I've said many times before, and because we've just exceeded our fourth dimensional boundary on this conversation, the frame that you're looking at now has, it's just got so hard and result. That's got height, and it's got width. What you cannot perceive is that it has depth. And there's another quality to it that you cannot perceive, and that is that it has length. It has duration is the term I'm looking for. So the Stratosphere Lounge today, you're seeing in 2 dimensions. You're seeing a 2-dimensional representation of a 3-dimensional world, and you're also getting the 4th dimension, which is duration. An object exists in space, and it exists there for a certain amount of time. I said this before. I love this idea so much. When you take a picture of something, you take a photograph of something, you're taking a 3-dimensional object, reducing it to 2 dimensions, but you're carrying it through the 4th dimension. If I have a photograph of something that happened to me when I was a kid, that photograph preserves an image of that moment through the 4th dimension. A photograph is moving, is an object moving through the 4th dimension. That's really cool. Anyway, this concludes our